specifically when you see that sort of navy blue speech bubble there in the upper right hand corner, that'll indicate an opportunity to share your thoughts regarding a particular question that we're posing. So if you see that bubble, definitely heads up. We'd love to hear from you, but also feel free to share any other time as well. Okay, so our work that we do with Project Success, as well as the topics that we're going to be talking about today, namely presuming competence in students with disabilities, this all stems from a broad research base, and it's also supported by federal legislation and guidance, primarily the Every Student Succeeds Act here, and then the Dear Colleague letter that came out right around the same time. We know that presuming competence in students with disabilities is what's best for them, but it's nice to know that these pieces are also in line with sort of this growing body of research that also supports these ideas. What it really comes down to is the simple fact is when we expect students to learn, or we expect that students have the ability to learn, they're more likely to do so. You know, there's a saying out there, no one rises to low expectations. And so if that's all we hold for students, then there's no incentive to rise above that. This doesn't mean that expecting students to learn is going to guarantee success on a comparable level to their non-disabled peers, but it does give them a better chance at getting closer to that target. Now, this outcome relies heavily on sort of us as educators to promote that equity and provide meaningful access. You saw that on the agenda, you see it here on this slide. It's a big piece of this, providing meaningful access for students, no matter the type or intensity of disabilities that have been identified for them. So as this graphic points out, there's a shared responsibility among general educators, special educators, administrators at both the building and district level, related services personnel, paraprofessionals, even families, right? This shared responsibility among all of us to ensure that we're maintaining high expectations for students with disabilities and that we're considering meaningful access in everything we do. So that's the curriculum that we're providing, the instruction that we're providing, assessments that we're giving these students. And then all of that is sort of further held together by those arrows around the outside, the implementation of universal design for learning and multi-tiered system of supports. I was trying to see how many buzzwords I can fit into one slide. I think I almost got a bingo. The point here is, I think in the past, it was always a very separate situation. It was special ed teachers do special ed things with special ed students, and gen ed teachers do gen ed things with gen ed students. And now it's really, we're coming together with that shared responsibility to understand that, you know, all students are our students. So with that in mind, let's consider these two questions. And this is the first time I'm going to want to hear from you all and your thoughts on these questions. What are the rights of students with disabilities? And then what are our responsibilities as educators of students with disabilities? Share your thoughts in the chat box. I'm going to see if I can see the chat box. I know it takes just a second for everybody to get their thoughts together and get it typed out. So I'm seeing the student has the right to an equal playing field, and our responsibility is to provide the supports to get them there. That's great. Everyone has the right to learn, regardless of level of disability. There's a right to FAPE and LRE. So for the newer ones with us today, FAPE, right, is free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environment. Excellent. Free and appropriate education. Right to have access to what everyone else does. Same rights as any other student. Yeah, I think y'all are on board here. All students have the right to a quality education. Educators have the responsibility to provide it. I feel like y'all got a sneak peek at my slides, at my notes. That's great. That's great to see that you guys are on board with this. So truly, it does boil down to the rights of all students, but including those students with disabilities, have the right to access the same things as their non-disabled peers. That means content, settings, the peers themselves, experiences, all of those things. Students with disabilities have the right to access that. And that means that our responsibilities as educators center on being able to provide that access, even if it means doing something, you know, quote unquote, different from what we've always done. Another way of thinking of this, or sort of to further bolster that, is to look at this graphic. So this is the top half of a graphic. We'll look at the bottom half here in a second. And I'm sure you all have heard this idea before, fair is not always equal, but I really liked this particular graphic and how it made the point. There's some in education, I think that they worry that doing things differently for students with disabilities is somehow unfair to students without identified disabilities, or even within students who have identified disabilities. If we're treating them differently in some way, that might be unfair. And we really need to just sort of let go of that idea that something isn't quote unquote fair just because it's not the same as what other people have or what other people are doing. And I do think this graphic does a good job at breaking this down by comparing education and medicine. So if you compare this group of children here, they're going to the doctor for a variety of medical reasons. You know, they've got a scraped knee, a broken arm, a cough, and the doctor is prescribing the same treatment, cough medicine, to all of them. This approach is equal, which sounds good on the surface to have equality, but it's not equitable, right? It's not what everyone needs. So it's certainly not fair because only one student here is actually getting the treatment that they need. It's the same with education. So here's the bottom half of that graphic. It's the same when we're thinking about our expectations for students with disabilities as well, even and especially those with more significant disabilities. We wouldn't provide the same educational treatment to students who are demonstrating a wide variety of needs. And fair wouldn't mean that students with and without identified disabilities receive the same instruction, the same services, same supports. Instead, what fair means is that each student gets what they need in order to be successful. I don't know if you're familiar with Shelley Moore. We're going to talk about her later near the end. She's got a fantastic video. She's a wonderful inclusion advocate. She does a really good job of talking about inclusion and presuming competence. There's a brand new video she put out, but really just that students deserve what they need. It's not about equality and everyone getting the same. It's students need what they need to be successful. So the point is not necessarily for a student with a disability to be doing the same volume of work or the same complexity of work as a student without identified disabilities. The point is for them to have equal access to that same content. And we can talk about that more in greater detail as we go along. So I mentioned inclusion already and how they're certainly, inseparable when we're thinking about this idea of presuming competence in our students. But I wanted to take just a second to point out what kind of inclusion are we talking about? It's not just physical inclusion. I think for a long time, when this mode of inclusion, this method came about, this model that we're including students with disabilities, we're putting them in the general education classrooms, and we all sort of patted ourselves on the back and said, yes, we got inclusion down, they're in there. And that would be that physical piece of inclusion, right? That's certainly a piece of it, but I don't want us to stop there. So there's also the ideas of social inclusion, so that these students are being included and supported in non-academic activities with same age peers. And then beyond that, truly narrowing in on the academic piece of that students with disabilities, including students with the most significant disabilities, being exposed to and supported in grade level content. It's true. This is part of inclusion as well. It's not just sticking them in the room and hoping for the best. It's really working to make everything accessible to them, not just their physical classroom environment. So this connects back to what we just talked about, which is, we're having to remember that fair doesn't necessarily mean equal. Participating in grade level gen ed content and instruction doesn't have to look the same for every student. And in fact, it really shouldn't look the same. What we're focusing on here is their right to access that content. So I promised we're going to get to the building blocks of an inclusive mindset. Here they are. And at the bottom, sort of as the foundation, you'll see presumed competence. And I promise I'll get to a definition of that here in just a second. But sort of once we acknowledge that fair is not always meaning equal, we're going to start looking at these other building blocks that make up an inclusive mindset. Presuming competence in a nutshell, we'll talk about it more, but presuming competence means that we start off by assuming students are inherently capable, and that we as the educators need to work to find ways to allow those capabilities to emerge. The second building block is least dangerous assumption. And what that means is making decisions for and about student learning that will ultimately cause the least harm to that student's ability to function independently as an adult. I think a lot of times teachers, we might want to coddle our students a little bit, or we don't give them the benefit of the doubt. We don't want things to be so hard for them, but that can ultimately sort of cause harm in the long run for their ability to function independently. And so least dangerous assumption means that we're really trying not to do that. We're trying to always make decisions that will ultimately harm them the least in the long run. And lastly, having high expectations. I've said that phrase frequently, and I'll keep saying it. What's important about that is to know that, one, we're not just settling for status quo for students with disabilities, but it also doesn't mean that we're having unreasonable expectations as well, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Really, instead, when we think about high expectations for our students with disabilities, it's that we're being intentional about setting ambitious goals for sure, but we want them to be reasonable, aligned to what our students' needs are. So let's dig in a little bit more. So on the left here, you see sort of my one interpretation of how I envision sort of a metaphor for thinking about presumed competence. It's easy, if you consider a student to be like a tree, it's easy for us to get caught up in thinking that what we see in a student, so the trunk, the branches, the leaves in this image, that's the whole tree. And it's important to remember that there's a part of the tree, the roots, that we can't see. So the roots in this instance represent the competence that we're presuming students to have, even though it may not be outwardly visible. And again, back to educator responsibility, it's part of our responsibility to provide sort of that appropriate nourishment to those roots in order for the tree or the student to thrive. Different trees require different growing conditions. And so, similarly, different students are going to require different learning conditions or supports. But what it comes down to, I would say, is it's critical for us to realize that a student's difficulties with demonstrating knowledge or demonstrating their abilities should not be interpreted as evidence of intellectual incompetence. So that's sort of what's going on here on the right. Just because we can't see direct evidence of competence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So we can't look at that absence of evidence and say, aha, I have evidence that this student can't learn, because see, there's no evidence that they can learn. It's not the same thing, right? So that it's important that we don't get caught up in thinking that. And I will say too, this is true for all students, especially students with disabilities, and even especially students who are carrying the extra weight of having one or more disabilities or a significant disability. Thinking about that, so many disabilities are identified using test scores from IQ and achievement testing, but that is one piece of data. And so simply identifying that a student has something that's considered a low IQ, or thinking about other students who have maybe complex physical or communication challenges, none of that means that they're automatically incapable of something. Is it possible that their disability is going to prevent them from doing something or knowing something? Absolutely. But do we know that for sure? We don't. And so that's where the presuming competence piece comes in. I'm going to assume that my students have capability, but I am going to have to work to find ways to sort of let those capabilities out. What this sort of means for us, and how it sort of manifests itself when we're presuming competence in our students, we're going to be influencing how actively we engage our students and how engaged that student is in their education. So if we assume that a student has that ability, we're going to be more willing to engage with them. And then that student is automatically going to be more engaged in what's going on around them. It's sort of it's a full circle, comes full circle. When we presume competence, we're also going to be influencing how often we talk to that student, what kind of tone we use with them, and how we speak about the student to others. It's easier, I think, when you already presume competence in that student, the tone that you use both with them and when speaking with others, you just have a different tone about you. And that's really powerful, especially for our students who have some communication challenges. That doesn't mean that they don't hear or are aware of what's going on around them, right? They can really pick up on some of that. So that's an important piece. And then these last two here, we're also going to be influencing the complexity of information that we offer and how much effort and patience we use to resolve challenges. And I think that one is probably maybe the most important of all. When we know in ourselves that our students are capable, we are going to feel like we have more patience to deal with challenges. We're going to put forth more effort because we know we're having an impact, even if we don't see the results on the outside. So presuming competence influences a lot. And what I want to hear from you guys now, I'm sure you've noticed that blue chat box, when's she going to let us talk? I want to hear now, either teachers or sort of related services personnel, those of you who are working with students on a daily basis, what are some ways that you demonstrate presumed competence with your students? And to our leaders out there, how are you encouraging teachers to presume competence in students? So let me hear from you in the chat box on that. So Tammy shared reading grade level material. Yeah, and what does reading mean, right? Reading can mean reading, decoding, it can be listening, it can be looking at the pictures and interpreting information. Grade level is important, Amy points out, absolutely. Exposure to that grade level material. Are we necessarily holding them to the expectations of other grade level peers? Not necessarily, but they have the right to be exposed to that. Read aloud. Yeah, read aloud, okay, yep. Opportunities to express themselves with AAC, yes. Alternative and augmentative communication, that's so critical for our students. Not only those with significant disabilities, but many students. Oh, we're flying through here. A lot of nonverbal choices, matching, picture exchange. Teach a bit higher to have them be exposed, and they usually will reach or try harder. That's exactly right. I can't tell you, Amy could say too, we've heard so many stories about, you know, I didn't realize they were listening, or I didn't realize they were paying attention or picking up on what we were talking about. And then they, you know, a parent will call and say, you know, they were talking about cells and biomes and, you know, all these crazy things. Yes, oftentimes students who are exposed to these things, they're picking up on things that we never even realized. And imagine what happens if you never present that to them in the first place, right? You're artificially stunting them. Content, age, grade level exposure. Yes, focus on communication. Keeping the kids talking about what they're learning. Yes, Renee, that's so important. Asking questions using things they're familiar with. This is great. I can't read all these. These are really good. Providing training and offering teachers opportunities to observe other educators presuming competence. I think that's key. So for our leaders, our educators, or our administrators, being able to observe someone else who's doing it well can be really helpful. Amy pointed out wait time. I'm a big fan of wait time, and not just wait time like, oh, I know I need to wait and give them a second to kind of get their thoughts together, but I mean wait time until it almost gets uncomfortable, right? Because that indicates to students that you believe they have something of value to say and you're willing to wait for it. And it may not happen right away, but the more you practice that with your students, they'll pick up on, okay, I guess I'm supposed to have something to say here or something to respond to. And that sort of ups the ante for them. That's great. Training of one-to-one paras, working in groups with non-disabled peers, that's really important. Yes, making sure paras have the same mindset. You guys, I could read this all day. This is wonderful. I'm going to go back through the transcript when we're done here. That's awesome. Keep sharing. If you're still thinking of ideas, definitely keep putting them in the chat so everyone can read through them. I'm going to keep going in the interest of time, but these are fantastic thoughts, and I really appreciate you sharing them. So presuming competence, that was our first building block that we were talking about for an inclusive mindset. Now we're going to talk about the least dangerous assumption. I already sort of reviewed what it is, you know, really in a nutshell, but what I wanted to point out here is thinking about too, I think a lot of times educators will try to make decisions that make things easier in the short term, either for the student or for us. But perhaps in the long term, that might be interfering with the student's ability to function independently. So just pointing out that it's important that we're considering both that short and long-term perspective. So choosing, you know, what's easier for you or the student in the short term could lead to less independence in the future, but putting in the hard work now could lead to greater independence for that student down the line. And then thinking about, let's see if I can, here we go. This is the easiest way I've found to consider briefly what least dangerous assumption really means and the power of operating under the least dangerous assumption. So consider these two scenarios. Here's the first one. What if we assume that students can learn, no matter their disability, the intensity of their disability, their ability to communicate typically or not, whether we look at them and see that they look like they're paying attention or not? What if we just assume students can learn? So we give them every opportunity, and it turns out they can't. Maybe, and I always say here, maybe there's some kind of new brain scanning technology that comes about, and we really truly can find out that a student cannot learn. What is the outcome then? If we made that assumption that they can learn, we give them every opportunity to do it, but it turns out they can't. That hasn't really impacted the student's ability to function independently, right? I mean, that it just hasn't done much of anything. On the other hand, here we go, if we assume that the presence of a disability, even a significant intellectual disability, means that a student can't learn, we might not give them every opportunity to do so. Then imagine that same, magical brain scanning technology comes out and shows us that the student could in fact learn, that they did have a greater ability to learn than we first thought. What harm would have been done then? If we started with that assumption, like, no, they can't do that. They've got their IQ is 60. There's no way they're gonna be able to do that. So I'm not going to expose them to grade level content, peers, settings, and so forth. And it turns out they could be learning that whole time. That is gonna have a huge impact on their ability to function independently, right? So that's what we mean when we say least dangerous assumption. We're going to assume that they have the ability, and we're gonna make decisions that align with that. And really, what that means then leads us into our third building block. The least dangerous assumption is to have high expectations for all students. If we're making the least dangerous assumption, we're going to make sure that at a minimum, students are having access to the gen ed setting and curriculum to the maximum extent appropriate. And so that's where that LRE comes in that we mentioned briefly earlier. Here just to show, excuse me, that, there we go, that this comes straight from the Dear Colleague letter that's aligned to Every Student Succeeds Act. That, some of you were mentioning FAPE earlier, right? Free and appropriate public education. In order for that to truly be provided, students with disabilities have to be involved in and making progress in the general education curriculum. That's part of FAPE. Now, how we do that and how we break it down and how we make it more accessible and all of that, that's, to be determined. And we can discuss different ways to do that. But the bottom line is students have the right to that access. And so again, as I was mentioning earlier, it's not just that physical access piece of being in the room, but also having intellectual access to the content as well. And when we put both of those together, that's where we're really getting that true, beautiful, colorful inclusion that's best for students. And the reason, again, why I keep harping on access is just to say that access leads to participation, which leads to learning, right? That's just the trajectory that we follow here. And if access at the beginning is cut off, access to content, to peers, to settings, experiences, if that's cut off, then their participation is cut off. And then every bit of learning that could have come from that participation is also cut off. And so if educators can start with that access piece, there's going to be so much more that comes after that, right? So it all starts with us providing that access. If everyone could take just a moment to make sure you're muted. I'm hearing someone who's maybe not quite too happy with me. All right. And here, this is a great piece here. This quote,
Miss Quick, you muted yourself.
Ashley, I did. I muted everyone, including you. So
hey now.
All means all.
All means all. All means all.
Sorry about
equal.
that.
That was equal, but that was not equitable. It was not what I meant. Okay, I think we're back on track. I just wanted to provide this quote. I think a lot of you are sort of on board with this idea, and so you may not need to continue hearing these ideas over and over again, but I do find this to be a pretty persuasive piece of information and research to share with people who are maybe still a little more skeptical. So maybe tuck this in your back pocket to take back with you to your schools for people who may need a little more convincing. And it's this bit of research, and there's other research, this is just one quote that I pulled, says that placement in inclusive classrooms, and this goes for even students with the most significant disabilities, placement in those inclusive classrooms does not interfere with the academic performance of students without disabilities with respect to all these things that are listed here. So, a lot of times teachers are worried about, oh, won't that be so disruptive? It's going to take time away from the other kids. How is everybody going to get, to where they need to be if I'm spending time over here? And all of these kinds of things. Won't it be more chaotic and all this kind of stuff? Now, on a daily basis, there could certainly be situations where, interruptions are occurring or lessons are less seamless than, you wanted them to be. But this research shows that long-term, when you can take yourself out of that sort of daily emotionally invested chaos, long-term achievement is not impacted by that. In fact, there are many studies that show that achievement in different areas is increased in inclusive classrooms compared to classrooms that don't have students with disabilities, even students with significant disabilities. So again, this is just a tidbit of research you can share, and I should say, this doesn't mean that there isn't a fair amount of work and planning that has to take place in order for this to end up this way, in order for the outcomes to be high, but it's possible. And that's the point that I wanted to be making here. So another way of looking at this, again, about thinking about the high expectations, I've said this already, it doesn't mean having unreasonable expectations, but I think this visual does a good job of sort of putting that into perspective. So fair doesn't always mean equal. We know that already. And I mentioned this earlier too about the low expectations. So when we have high expectations for students, we're making room for them to grow. That's what that red arrow is showing. If we're keeping our expectations low, we're sort of artificially stunting the growth that they might have achieved otherwise. They may never reach what high expectation we hold for them, but if it's higher than here, maybe they'll get halfway there or 3/4 of the way or 1/4 of the way there. But any of that is more than it would have been if we had just kept our expectations lower. So what I'm really focusing in on here is that red arrow, that we're making room for students to grow when we raise our high expectations. We're not going to punish them for not reaching the expectation. We're going to provide the room for them to grow, right? We don't know really what any student is capable of. We can't know for sure. We can't climb into their heads and find out what's really going on in there. But one thing we do know is that students can't learn what they're not taught. So again, back to that idea of access and exposure and things like that. If we're not providing that access, they're not going to sort of generate that content knowledge amongst themselves, right? We have to make sure that that access is there. These next couple slides here, there's a chart here for academic expectations, and the next one we'll look at is for more social-emotional. But these are some quick ways that you can think about, am I reflecting high expectations to my students? Or for our leaders and administrators, you're looking at your teachers, how can you know, just in a quick snapshot, whether your teachers are demonstrating high expectations for their students? I won't read all of them, but I will point out one of them. For example, it's that wait time, right, that I spoke of earlier. If you ask a question and then provide adequate wait time, that indicates to the student that you believe they have something of value to say. And it does, you may have to get a little uncomfortable with how long the wait time is, but without giving them time to both process the question, sort of access the information in their brain, and formulate a response. I mean, think that that's a lot going on, right? Especially for our students with some of those intellectual disabilities. If we don't give them time to do all that, we're implying that they're not capable of doing it. And we don't want to make that implication at all, right? So again, these are just some quick ways that you can make sure you're reflecting high expectations sort of more in that academic realm. And then also just even social emotionally, right? The way that we interact with our students also says a lot about what we believe about them. So we're going to speak to our students, as conversation partners, even if they're not able to respond in a typical manner. We're going to involve them in what's going on around them. We're going to just in general value their contributions to the classroom. And here is where I'll point out too, it's so easy to get stuck thinking that students who have difficulties with communication, that is sort of equal to that they have a lack of intelligence, right? If the intelligence isn't coming out of their mouth, then they must not have it. If they're not able to communicate it to me, then they probably just, there's not a lot we can do there. And that's just simply not the case. It's just not the case, right? So separate communication and intelligence in your mind. Those two things are not linked really in any way whatsoever. And then two, I would say, don't get caught up thinking that sort of a lack of prerequisite skills is equal to, don't get caught up in thinking that if the student doesn't have prerequisite skills, we shouldn't give them opportunities to engage in higher level academics. That's what I'm trying to say. Even without those prerequisite skills, there are pieces they can pick up from being exposed to that higher content knowledge. And it's important that we give them that chance. A lot of these things on these two slides, they're not new. Good teachers naturally do many of these things, but the important piece is to be intentional about it and consistent about it. In reflecting high expectations to all our students, disabilities or not. So now I want to hear from you again, sort of these expectations in practice. What are some of the instructional strategies that you use to reflect high expectations for your students? How do you ensure that students are having access to that grade level aligned content? Leaders, how do you encourage your teachers to be having those high expectations, and what kind of instructional strategies do you encourage the use of? So I'll give you just a moment here. What kind of instructional strategies do you use that reflect high expectations for students? So we talked a lot about ways that you all presume competence in your students. And of course, this overlaps quite a bit, but curious now about specific instructional. Renee, you have to try before you can ever give up. You never know. Ask if you're for help 100%. And you have to try and then try again and then try again, give up and then try again and again and again and again, right? There's no set number of times that we can try and then give up. Yeah, present content using high interest as motivators. That's huge. Yes. Check in with classroom teachers often on student progress. Okay, from the SLP perspective, thank you. Yes, so important to have that sort of integration of our teachers, our gen ed teachers, special ed teachers with our related services. Absolutely. Using motivating activities and themes. Scientific method and inquiry, that's great. Yeah, I'm hearing several sort of nods to UDL, Universal Design for Learning, right? That engagement piece especially. You're not really going to learn stuff that you're not interested in or motivated to learn. Although my students are non-speaking, I feel their brain with information and ask comprehension questions with 2 to 3 word visual word choices. Yes. Oh, now they're starting to pop up. Getting students involved in their educational decisions. Yes, they help develop their goals, learn how to advocate for themselves. Yes, yes, yes. Expect the same, but approach differently. Yeah, I like that. I like that. It may not always be exactly the same, right? Depending on what kind of student we're talking about and their needs, but 100% we're going to maintain high expectations, just like we would for any other student, but we may need to approach it differently. Making things relate to real life, that is so important. Wait time, yes, give them time to process before you give them another prompt. Otherwise, they have to start over again, right? They have to start processing all over again. Make it fun, find a game. This is great, modeling from peers. Ooh, I like that one about encouraging confidence. The first answer is usually the correct answer to those who doubt themselves. I really like that. Encourage whole group instruction and allow multiple ways for students to interact and respond. There's that UDL again. You guys, I'm going to read it all day long. This is really great. Choices about how they will demonstrate mastery. Love that. Love that. Encourage students to try, even if they give a wrong answer, help them go back to find the correct answer. This is all fantastic. Resources at imdetermined.org. Ooh, love that. Okay. I know I'm getting a little low, well, lowish on time. I'm going to keep going, but keep putting those thoughts in the chat box. This is wonderful, wonderful stuff. I love it. I'm sad that I can't keep reading it. Okay, let's keep going. So again, here I go again with about the meaningful access, right? I just wanted to kind of point out a couple of things here about what that means, especially when we're talking about general education expectations. So when we're thinking about how to provide that meaningful access, whether it's aligned to standards, academic standards, or alternate standards for our students with the most significant disabilities, we're going to start by considering the general education expectations. We're never going to automatically sort of handicap ourselves down to, or we're going to start way down here. We're always going to start with the gen ed expectations, and then we're going to consider first what accommodations could we put into place, and then what modifications we can put into place. And we need to be very careful about which one of those we use when and for which students, right? So accommodations, as it says here, when you're providing accommodations, that's really changing how content is either taught, how it's accessed by the student, or how it's assessed by the educator. So it's sort of changing everything around the content and how a student is able to interact with it and engage with it, but it's not changing actual content as far as what the standard is. When we get into modification, that's when we're changing the content in terms of the standard or the expectation of mastery of the standard. And I want to be really careful about how I phrase that. The materials that you use to teach a standard could be very different. So when I say content, I don't mean like a particular textbook or even a particular grade level reading passage or something like that. You can certainly have varied passages, varied textbooks, varied all these things, varied materials. Those would be accommodations. Modifying is when we're taking them off that grade level standard, when we're changing somehow the expectation of mastery. That's modification, and we're only doing that for students with the most significant disabilities, because when we're modifying curriculum, taking them off grade level, then that's taking them off deployment track, and we just simply don't want to do that. There's so much research out there that shows when given the right, services, supports, accommodations, all the things, how many students can achieve a diploma without having to resort to modification. So we really want to stay away from that and only do that for the students with the most significant needs. But I will say too, for students with significant needs, don't shy away from using modifications. That's a brilliant way of providing access to gen ed content, to be able to modify it, to condense it, to shorten it, to really zero in on one particular key idea within a standard, rather than expecting mastery of the whole standard. That's a brilliant way to provide access to those students. So don't let me scare you with that. This is a way that you can think through what it looks like. Okay, I have a set of gen ed expectations. How might I provide some accommodations in that way? What might it look like to provide modifications in that way? Again, it doesn't have to look the same. Students don't have to be held to the same criteria. And this is just one example. So here, in this sort of theoretical example, students are asked to write some kind of essay or report or something. And then there are sort of 5 main expectations that have been identified in that left column. And then in the middle column, we're thinking about, okay, what are some potential accommodations that could be made here so that a student with a disability can still engage in that gen ed expectation, meet that gen ed expectation, but in a way that is aligned to their abilities. And so for instance, if the gen ed expectation is that a student will independently select a topic for this paper or essay or whatever is happening, potentially a student will have those topics read aloud. That allows them to access the information, but they can still select a topic, just as is expected. Now, the potential modification might be selecting from reduced options. Right now, we've sort of, we've altered the expectation there a bit. They're still participating in that activity of selecting a topic, but we're going to reduce the options. I don't want to talk my way through this entire chart, although I would love to, because I think it might get a little redundant, but know that this is here. Please feel free to go back to it, look at it as a reference, because the main point here is this is applicable to any situation, assignment, standard that you're thinking about. If you can break it down into the key sort of expectations that are coming from that lesson or that standard, and then once you have those identified, slide over and say, okay, so for students who need a different way to access that content, or a different way to be taught that content, or a different way to be assessed on that content, how can I accommodate them? And then for my students who we need to be providing a modification for, what might that look like? But always start off with the gen ed expectations first. So we have talked a lot about presuming competence, why we should do it, but there's still sort of this lingering question of how to make it all work. I wanted to provide you this slide here to give you some ideas to sort of explore further on your own. So each of the elements listed in these bubbles play a part in supporting high expectations of students, really with any student with a disability, but especially students with significant disabilities. And it's also going to help make sure that they have that appropriate access to grade level content settings, peers, experiences. Each of these bubbles, honestly, could be probably a whole training series by themselves, but this at least plants some seeds for you with some ideas to research further. And here on the next slide, there are some additional resources aligned to these elements that you'll be able to begin exploring. So we've got unpacking standards, which is really, you can do that for either academic standards or the alternate standards for students with the most significant needs. You can unpack them, break them down into their essential elements, what are the key skills that are needed, and so forth. That's really going to be a strategy that supports high expectations. Then I will say, as I start reviewing these, if you will, in the chat box, oh no, it's not on here. I did have a speech bubble. I want to hear from you all. Oh no, Amy's going to give a poll. That's right. I want to hear which area you're most comfortable in and which area you might be able to use more support in. So hopefully a poll is coming. Think about your answers while I keep talking here. So gen ed alignment, that's a key piece. That is thinking about, truly what you're doing with your students with disabilities. Is it aligned to what's going on in gen ed? And this is especially for our students with more significant needs who may be in a separate setting much of the time. because the more alignment there is to gen ed, the more opportunities there are to increase that inclusion and increase that participation in the gen ed setting. So that's a big piece. Curriculum mapping is huge, both again for students with significant needs as well as those who are participating in the gen ed the majority of the time. When you're intentional about how your curriculum is mapped out, you can be intentional about how you break it down, how you maybe pre-teach things ahead of time, or what sorts of skills or activities you're working on ahead of time. It really lays out a better framework for you across the board, across the school year, to be able to involve students with disabilities and keep those high expectations. Okay, most comfortable accommodating and modifying, that's not a surprise. Specially designed instruction, that's impressive. Okay, that's impressive. Yeah, so specially designed instruction. I just listened to a presentation today by Marilyn Friend. She's kind of a boss on co-teaching and specially designed instruction. And she was making the point that, truly specially designed instruction is special ed, period. It's what makes special ed special ed. Otherwise, it's just what happens for every other student, right? So what are those key pieces that are happening by special educators to support special education students? And the key distinction here is it's not accommodations or modifications. Those are not considered specially designed instruction. Those are accommodations and modifications, right? Specially designed instruction talks about what we're doing as educators. So that's a key piece. Universal design for learning, I already briefly mentioned, but that's a huge piece. And that goes for all students, maintaining high expectations and really helping students access more when everything is as universally designed as possible, so that there are multiple ways of engaging in all the things that are going on around you. That just makes things better for everyone, right? But especially our students with disabilities. And then finally, accommodating and modifying. So I'm seeing here, this is so interesting. Yeah. So most comfortable, a lot of people are comfortable with accommodating and modifying. We're comfortable with specially designed instruction. Curriculum mapping is far down the line, along with unpacking standards, universal design for learning. That is so interesting. So then let's see, your least comfortable. Yeah, gen ed alignment, unpack, it's all kind of spread out evenly. Yeah, that's so interesting to me. Thank you for sharing that. That's really good information. You'll see here, and actually I'll flip to this slide now as we keep kind of seeing a few more votes come in. I tried to bring just a couple of resources in for each of these elements that I reviewed. I didn't want to completely overwhelm everyone, but I did want to be able to give you at least a starting point for looking into each of these elements further. So you'll see just a couple resources aligned to each of those elements. I'm trying to think if there are any I want to specifically point out. I will say this CAST UDL Exchange is amazing. CAST is a wonderful organization that's really their whole focus is universal design for learning, and they have so much wonderful information broken down into so much detail. So that for sure is one to check out if that's you've identified universal design for learning as one that you're not too sure about. You could get lost in there for days, but it's wonderful information. Let's keep going because I want to have time for questions. To here, knowing that so many of us are still in a virtual world, a virtual learning world, we wanted to make sure that you had some resources specific to that. So there are guidance documents, there's a resource list here that we have, a recorded webinar. All of this is going to provide sort of additional information for you to be supporting families, to find new resources to use for supporting students with significant needs, as well as that last guidance document, how you can utilize paraprofessionals in your distance learning or your virtual learning. So additional resources for you to check out there. And then I can hardly believe I've made it to this point with 7 minutes to go. Normally it's 7 minutes after the fact. Long story short, I love wrapping up this way by saying, if you're tempted to say I can't, have the courage to add yet. And this goes for students as well as us as adults. So as educators, we have to be okay with having those high expectations for our students, even without the sort of that satisfaction of seeing it to fruition or being able to really tell, did they get it? Did they really get it? I don't know, I can't tell. They're not able to show me. We kind of have to be okay with exposing our students to that content and maybe never knowing for sure whether or what they caught on to there. So instead, we're going to be thinking about that power yet, right? The students aren't demonstrating that they understand this yet. They're not able to do this yet. And it's our job to figure out how to sort of build that bridge to get them to that yet. So what questions do you have? And while you're thinking of your questions, I'll point out here, I know I mentioned earlier, Shelley Moore. This is her video that just came out a couple days ago on the importance of presuming competence. She does wonderful videos that are 5-6-ish minutes, so real quick tidbits. And she's a really engaging presenter too. So if you haven't heard of her, I definitely recommend checking her out. But the link is here on your presentation. She'd probably be a little more succinct of a speaker on presumed competence than I was, but I do recommend checking her out. What questions do you have? Let me know in the chat box. Can we get a copy of the presentation? And absolutely. Amy's put the link to Shelley's video right in the chat box there. It's also linked on the slides. I think a copy of the slides was shared in the chat, but I'm sure Amy is getting ready to put it in there again. Oh, she's going to email it to everybody. There you go. And I will say, well, on the next slide here in just a second, my email address is there. Feel free to contact me really with any questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'm happy to try to find someone who does. Let's see, what are some strategies to shift mindsets in educators about setting high expectations for students with disabilities? That is the million-dollar question. If I could, I would write a book and retire to an island somewhere with these strategies. It's the key question, right? If we already have educators who have these mindsets that are sort of in these old ways, or and by no fault of their own, that's just how we were taught, right? Special ed does special ed things, gen ed does gen ed things. Honestly, the thing I think that I have found to be most impactful or effective for people who are working on shifting their mindset is to see it in action. So if you have a teacher in the building who's doing things well as far as presuming competence or maintaining high expectations and all that, if another person can see that in action, can see truly, look, they're having these high expectations, they're presuming competence, they're putting content in front of these kids, and no, they're not getting 100% of it, but look what they're doing, they're engaged with their peers and all these things. Really witnessing, I think, firsthand is the most powerful way to shift those mindsets. Some people respond to research. I'm sort of a research nerd, so I really like digging into that research. I mean, there really is hard data that shows, these things I've been talking about improved outcomes for students with disabilities when they're in inclusion settings and things like that. I don't know, Amy, feel free to jump in, but honestly, the main one that I would say is just anywhere and everywhere that you can find sort of an example to look toward, and pairing someone up who is doing it well too. Not only just showing them, but if you're able to get them connected with someone who can sort of support them along the way, because it can be a very overwhelming thing to think about, holy cow, now I have to figure out how to present grade level content to my students who all I've really been doing is colors and shapes and things like that. That can be a lot. So really good question, really good question. Oh, let's see, will we receive a certificate of participation? That's a wonderful question that I will hope Amy will answer in the chat, because I am honestly not sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't do certificates just due to the large volume and the multiple states. Every state requires a little bit something different. If you're not able to report that on your own just with the materials and say, I went to the session, you feel free to reach out to me separately and I'll see what we can do. But just as a blanket, or will we be sending them out? We cannot do that this time. I apologize.
I see Anna said you've been moving all your Title I and special ed teachers toward a co-teaching model at least a couple days a week. It's really helped both the gen ed teachers and supplemental staff to understand one another. That's huge. Absolutely. Co-teaching is really powerful when it's done well. Yes, Amy's going to be sending out the presentation to everyone.
And the recording.
And the recording. Oh, good, good, good. Hey, and we had no children and no cats in our presentation. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
You better go check. You better go check on them.
I know.
I will say before we're starting to, some people are starting to sign off because I know we're like a couple minutes too. I'm going to throw you guys keep talking, but I'm going to throw the session evaluation link in there again. If everyone can take just 2 minutes, not even, to fill it out. We really
Yeah.
do value your feedback and your input as we look to refine these and continue to push out content that that's relevant, that people are interested in hearing.
Truly, I really do value the feedback, positive or otherwise. It's important. So yeah, definitely please fill out that evaluation if you get a second. Carol says you can't see what my dogs are up to. I did have a silly Zoom background on before we started, and I thought, oh, that's kind of distracting. I don't know. I don't think anyone's pulling anything behind me, so that's too funny. Mary's saying if your school doesn't provide the right equipment, teachers wear out. Yeah, I mean, teachers need to be supported. That's a really good point. Really good point. I think I started to say, I don't know if I ever got the whole idea out of my mouth. My email address is on the slide. So if you have questions, if there's something I didn't cover in enough detail, or I said something confusing, or you just want to know more, or looking for additional resources, I'm happy to help you out. Amy, I know she mentioned you can reach out to her with questions. Again, the Project Success website's on the bottom if you want to check that out. I love this topic so much, and I would talk about it for days. So I'm happy to do it with you if you have questions. If a gen ed teacher believes your child should be placed in a cluster, but you want them to remain in gen ed with nice supports and an aide, how can you work through this? Zoe, what a question. I mean, that's so hard because it involves sort of taking into consideration everyone's perspective, everyone's area of expertise, right? You got to take into consideration the gen ed teacher's perspective, your perspective, the family's perspective, and their sort of area of expertise and knowledge. It's so hard. I would start with this. Above all else, we want to make sure that that student is receiving as much gen ed content, curriculum, setting, peers, experiences as possible. And I can't believe it didn't come up, but normally we talk about that phrase maximum extent appropriate, right? That they need to have access to gen ed to the maximum extent appropriate. And I always put a big asterisk next to appropriate, and to point out that doesn't mean the maximum extent convenient. Where this isn't about convenience for us as teachers or any, our schedule and things like that, that it's truly about what's appropriate, and how even that definition of appropriate is changing now that we're talking about exposure to higher level content and changing, expectations for students with the most significant needs. So the short answer to that question is trying to come together on what your priorities are for that student, leaving setting out of it, leaving supports out of it for the moment, and truly just like, what are you trying to get to for that student? And then trying to pull in the pieces to decide what's the best way to get there while operating under the least dangerous assumption. Does that help? Can I steal that phrase, please? Steal all the phrases. Yes, please do. Yes. Please. I think it's so important, because I can't tell you how many times, from my time teaching, that everyone got so hung up on maximum extent appropriate. Well, it's not really appropriate. No, it's not appropriate for you because it makes your life harder. But we're not here for your convenience. We're here for the kids. So yes.
So Tammy has it. Did you see Tammy's question on there too, with students?
Oh, no, I didn't.
With non-speaking autism who struggle with dysregulation and sensory motor differences, have you had success with inclusion? That's a really interesting question, because you've already successfully identified potential barriers. And so thinking through because that was actually one of the things that I would have said to the other question too, is really figuring out where the barriers are and addressing those head on, and figuring out how to support those before you make any decisions about where the services should be received. Yeah. And I think, to the short answer to your question is yes, we've seen all kinds of different challenges addressed and had it successful with inclusion. Now, when you say inclusion, is the child going to be in class all day, engaged, with all the appropriate responses to instructions and all that? Probably not, but building in some really key supports along the way, and maybe some, sensory breaks, or even looking at there's a lot of research. I can't cite the person that we were working with it was about a year ago, on even how students are placed in physical positions and the classroom setting. So really looking at all of the different components that are going to help support those noted concerns with that, and high expectations and collaboration between the gen ed and the special ed teacher and whatever related services staff are probably likely involved in that situation. Yes, yes, don't give up. If it hasn't been successful, keep trying.
And two, just know that it doesn't have to go from 0 to 100, you know, in terms of inclusion, right? If they're currently minimally included and you're getting them in a little bit more, that's fantastic, right? As long as we're trying to move forward. And then two, additionally, I don't want it to sound like I'm advocating for 100% inclusion 100% of the day, regardless of any other factors. There are absolutely going to be times where, I mean, that's what the continuum of supports is, right? That there are going to be times that we need different settings and things like that, and that's fine. But to default to a separate setting just because a student has a significant disability or something like that is what we're trying to stay away from, right? We start in the gen ed setting, and then we decide, well, actually, they're going to need some additional supports here, or this might be more appropriate here. But we start with gen ed as the default. Ties in perfectly as a way to operationalize the SCOTUS ruling in the Ender case. Yes, yes, and I can't believe I didn't include that either. But yes, that you're exactly right. That's it. That you know, it's no longer okay to just provide the bare minimum to a student, which I think a lot of times is what we did as special ed teachers. Just trying to keep them happy and safe, and maybe we can learn a little or whatever. That isn't okay anymore, right? We really do have to be making efforts to provide them this content. So yeah, you're right. It ties in exactly with bare minimum. De minimis is no longer okay. These are good questions, good thoughts. Well, I know we're over time, and I don't want to keep everyone. I can't even see who all is left, but thank you so much. If you haven't already, please take a moment to fill out the evaluation. We really value your feedback. And if you do have additional questions or just want to bounce comments off me, I'd love to hear from you. So feel free to email. Other than that, everyone have a great evening. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. You too.
Or afternoon for our West Coast folks.
Right. Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's evening here.
Yeah.
Mary, you can't expect a fourth grader to understand all fourth grade materials when he has difficulty in counting to 10. 100%. No. And that would be where we're saying, right, we're not going to maintain the same expectations, but we can expose them to that content, and we can break it down to find ways to, you know, develop lessons where we do work on counting to 10 within whatever the fourth grade content is. But yeah, you're exactly right. We're not just kind of stickering it over and saying, well, he's a fourth grader, got to learn the fourth grade content.